Hello, everyone. Welcome to our 14th annual series on US-China economic relations and China's economic development. My name is Maggie Chen. I'm a professor of economics and international affairs here at GW, as well as a former director of the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP as we know it. I'm very delighted to welcome all of you to GW. For those of you who don't know us, IIEP is located at the Elliott School in GW's cross-school interdisciplinary research center. We aim to serve as a catalyst for high-quality, multidisciplinary, high-impact, and non-partisan research surrounding globalization. We support research and policy work in areas such as international finance, international trade, international development, poverty, climate change, and economic policy more broadly. We have for a very long time focused on China's economy and US-China economic relations. This year, we have had a number of distinguished speakers here at the Elliott School speak on related topics. Last week, for example, former Australian Prime Minister and current President of Asia Society, Kevin Rudd, discussed his new book titled The Avoidable War, The Dangers of a Catastrophic Conflict Between the US and Xi Jinping's China. In 2 weeks, on April 13th, Dr. Arvind Subramanian, former Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, will reflect on the development experiences, the similarities and differences between China and India, as well as the prospects of two countries going forward. I encourage all of you to take a look at our upcoming events on our website at iiep.gw.edu. I also invite you to visit our YouTube page to watch some of our previous events that you might have missed. Of course, these exciting events were only made possible with the support of our partners and alumni, in particular, Mr. Ning Li, Dan Stramillo, Frank Wang, and our IIEP Executive Circle. Today, we're very delighted to continue this year's US-China series with two outstanding economists. Our presenter today, Dr. Peterson, is Principal Economist at Federal Reserve Board. She currently serves as Associate Editor of the Journal of Money, Credit, and Banking. Her research interests include finance and macroeconomics. Her research has been published in leading academic journals, including the American Economic Review, Journal of Monetary Economics, and many other top journals. Her research has also been mentioned in Wall Street Journal, Brookings, Chicago Blues Review, and other outlets. Our discussant today is a long-term friend and one of the country's leading experts in trade and Chinese economy, Dr. Mary Lovely. Dr. Lovely is a senior fellow of the Peterson Institute and a professor at Syracuse University. She also served as a co-editor of China Economic Review. Some of her latest research projects are looking at American manufacturing employment and the relationship with outsourcing to low-income countries, the China's solar industry and the role of intellectual attorneys, and the structure of Chinese reforms of state-owned enterprises. Today, our speakers will discuss their insights on US-China tension. While the US-China tension is one of the most frequent headline topics in recent years, Dr. Song's work will provide one of the first quantitative measures on this topic and examine its implications for firms and aggregate economies. So now let me turn the floor over to Dr. Sun. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maggie, for the very generous introduction. And thank you all for joining me to discuss US-China tension today. I hope you can see the slides that I'm putting up right now. Can I get a thumb up? Okay, great. So the work is joint with John Rogers and Chris Webster. We actually started the project when both of them also worked at the board. The usual disclaimer absolutely applies here. This analysis and what I say here does not represent the views of the Federal Reserve Board or anybody else affiliated with the Fed system. I will also say that the work is in a relatively early stage. I'm really looking forward to learning from Mary's discussion, and also I would appreciate any feedback from all of you as well. Now let's dive right into it. So to start things off, here are some covers of The Economist over the past couple of years. I might be overwhelming you with visuals. The point I'm trying to convey is a simple one. the US-China relation over the past couple of years is arguably as contentious as it's been in recent decades, and that rising tension could foreshadow years of ruptured ties. That animosity runs deep and really cuts across partisan lines. If you think about it, right, the two countries, the US and China, they are just profoundly at odds on their views of how people and economies should be governed. These two major powers, they also jockey for influence well beyond their land. They compete in technology of all areas, and they also maneuver for military advantage on land, in outer space, and now in cyberspace as well. While in the meantime, these two countries are also major trade and business partners, making their rivalry really complex and consequential. In fact, this rising tension between the US and China has been widely cited by market participants and here by policymakers as a key determinant of economic activity and decisions. Arguably, there's been a broad view that US-China tension matters. Well, at the same time, to many others, including those once in power, concerns over US-China tension just seem hyperbolic at best, and perhaps outright wrong at worst, right? One problem here, I'm not saying that's all the problems there are, but one problem here is that despite the overwhelming attention US-China hostility has received, its significance in driving economic outcomes has now been empirically studied in the context of a long time series. The binding limitation, the binding constraint here has been the lack of a quantitative indicator, a indicator that can quantify the intensity of such bilateral tension and track its fluctuation, and an indicator that's available consistently through time. So as Maggie mentioned earlier, so that will be precisely what we turn to in this project. In this project, we're going to ask two questions. One, can we actually quantify public concerns over US-China tension? Put differently, can we actually come up with a fairly robust metric that would encompass a wide and consequential set of issues, including, but also going beyond trade conflict? Now, second, we want to ask, does this US-China tension really matter materially? Right? Does it have a tangible bite in any of the real decisions that firms have to make? Are there any significant economic effects showing up in the aggregate? Now, starting from the first question, measurement. What we aim to capture here is public concerns over US-China tension. So that's the perception that the public by and large holds, including households and business decision makers. And to get to that, it leads us to study news data. So for those of you who are less familiar with this literature, Baker, Bloom, and Davis, they pioneered a growing literature that utilizes news-based textual analysis and have achieved significant currency in the profession. The implicit assumption in that news-based literature is that newspapers have got to reflect the readership. If they don't reflect readership, they won't sell. Right? There is an additional angle to it, which I think is of paramount importance, especially for our purpose, which is that newspapers can also shape the perception of their readers. And their readership includes a large set of business decision makers, including the most influential. So the idea is that news media can really be an important vehicle for the spread of ideas and for coordinating beliefs. So with that thought in mind, what we're going to do is that we're going to quantify media coverage on high or rising US-China tension. And we're going to use that as a metric for public concerns over the bilateral tension. So specifically, the way we go about it is to compute this share of newspaper articles that contain search terms from these three broad categories, UCT, right? For a newspaper article to move up our index, the article has to mention the US, it has to mention China, it also has to contain terms indicating confrontation on at least one specific contentious issues. And so we compute this share every month over these leading US newspapers, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. The idea is that these are also widely circulated newspapers that business decision makers also likely follow. So this search-based approach really allows us to update our index in real time. It also allows our index to be easily interpretable. So now I just want to take a brief step back and tell you how we came up with these search terms in the first place. Right? So instead of using our own judgment in picking up words, instead we rely on machine learning algorithms to help us decide what words are likely relevant, what phrases are most frequently used in newspaper discussions on the bilateral tension. So the way we do it is that we began with all the newspaper articles that mention these two countries in the first place. And we randomly selected 5% of such articles, right? These are the articles that at least mention the US and China. And then so that gives us about 4,000 newspaper articles over our sample period. And we worked with research assistants and summer interns to identify articles that discuss bilateral tension. And so that process gives us about 1,000 articles that are manually classified as discussing high or rising US-China tension. And then we proceed to do cluster analysis, topic modeling, these machine learning algorithms that classify documents into implied topics and also identify words associated with each topic. So we begin with the most popular and empirically successful methodology, k-means. Since there's no agreed upon metric for deciding the optimal number of metrics, or you can call topics, we experimented with it and decided on 3 because the implied topics are most interpretable. That classified these newspaper articles into those that mostly discussing tension related to economic issues, or security-related issues, or ideology. And we also additionally applied 2 other machine learning algorithms for the exact same purpose, LDA and NewsMap. They also both classify the underlying newspaper documents into implied topics and also identify words likely associated with each topic. And not surprisingly, we see a lot of overlap in the output we gather from these 3 methods, and we take an expensive approach and just gather all the interpretable terms from these exercises, from the 3 methods, and we group them in these 3 broad categories that I just showed you, UCT. Okay, I just want to be clear that in our category T terms, we have those phrases indicating confrontation, such as hostile, tension, retaliate, and we also have terms on specific contentious issues. Now, I will say that we've done some human auditing for the objective of refining search terms. The refinement needed seemed pretty minimum, though. We did get rid of the Chinese names of the last names of Chinese leadership to reduce false positives. And we also did away with several words such as virus or bar, but that's pretty much it. So now I'm showing you the index that we have, the index of US-China tension. We call it UCT index. So I'm plotting it at the monthly frequency, and the series has also been normalized to have an average of 100 over the sample period. We take a lot of comfort in seeing that the index does fluctuate in ways that are consistent with related narratives described in political commentaries. I actually went through every single spike here, large, And all of them could be pinpointed within minutes to a fairly salient event that happened in that month. And also cross-check this with a number of commentaries. I'm getting an error message saying that my internet connection is unstable. So if I vanish, please shoot me an email. To pick up where I left off, to be sure that the index makes sense, I also cross-checked it with several political commentaries focusing on U.S.-China tension, including those produced by the Council on Foreign Relations, by Reuters, and in particular, a comprehensive overview done by the Congress. The alignment is very reassuring. And the alignment is actually in part reflected by these spikes labeled here that are matched up to specific events. Now, before moving on, while we all stare at this chart, I want to share two observations. One is on the level of UCT index, right? The level of tension, and the other would be on the nature of the tension. So on the level of this UCT index and the way it evolved over time across administrations, the variation here is largely in line with the differences in the overall attitude each administration held vis-a-vis China. Right, so you see the index rises through the Bush administration, who took a harder line on China compared to Clinton and labeled China a strategic competitor. And the index edged down during the first term of Obama administration, when Obama took a more cooperative stance and called China a strategic partner instead. And obviously, undeniably, tension escalated under Trump, and the index is shooting through the roof. And that tension continued on and moderated only marginally, if at all, under Biden. Now, the second observation on the nature of the tension, as I was working through all the spikes here, that has also evolved quite a bit over time. So conflicts clearly moved from those more of a geopolitical in nature in early years towards heavily economically focused over time. That reflects China's ascendancy in the global economy and the growing interdependence here. Now, so moving on, since we follow Baker, Bloom, and Davis' approach, utilizing news data to construct our index, I thought it might be of interest to show you how our index compares with their index. So Baker, Bloom, Davis construct this index of economic policy uncertainty, EPU, which is plotted in brown here, against our UCT index. And you could see that our index shows very little correlation, co-movement with EPU, except for during the trade war, when US-China tension was the root cause for policy uncertainty, and also at the onset of the pandemic for related but different reasons. Now, I want to just pause for a second and let's revisit the principal assumption here. The main premise here, and frankly, the main premise in this huge body of growing research that utilizes news data, is that news media reflects and shapes public opinion. Right? There has been a lot of research that has intrinsically relied on this assumption and has also made long strides in showing various proofs of concept. Nonetheless, we want to be conservative. So we want to ask ourselves if this assumption really holds true, if this assumption holds true in our particular concept. And so to that end, we conducted extensive analysis to evaluate the information content of our UCT index. And I'm going to show you some of the exercises we've done because they really boosted our confidence that our index could capture these ups and downs in the bilateral tension as perceived by major economic agents in the society. So in particular, what I'm going to show you first is that the UCT index provides a good gauge for business decision makers' perception. So to get to business decision makers' perception, we turn to US firms' primary communication device, which is these quarterly earnings conference calls that US public listed companies hold with interested parties. So in these earnings conference calls, firm management would discuss important aspects of firm performance and decisions. And we just take these transcripts of firms' earnings calls and compute the share of earnings call conversations that is devoted to US-China tension. And we use that as a metric for business decision makers concerned over US-China tension. And we find that metric tracks our UCT index incredibly closely. And second, I'm going to show you that the UCT index is correlated with firms' real decisions in ways that are highly indicative of US-China tension. I know that I'm being incredibly vague here. I'll expand on that in just a few minutes. So now let's talk about US firms' earnings call conversation and see how much of a share they tend to devote to US-China tension. So with this transcripts that we obtained from S&P, what we do is that for every single earnings call a firm had, we just count how many times China gets mentioned in close proximity to a tension word. So we count how many times the word China or Beijing shows up within 10 words apart from any of the terms indicating tension from our category T terms. So we take that and we normalize the number of occurrence by the total number of words in each transcript. So we get a share metric for each earnings call. And then we take that, every quarter we average that out across all firms. So that's how we get to this aggregate time series that's plotted in black here. And you can see that this share of earnings call discussions that's devoted to US-China tension, that share tracks our UCT index really closely. So these two series, they're correlated at 0.81 at the quarterly frequency, and that correlation rises above 0.1 at the annual frequency. And this upward trend in bilateral tension, you see that gets manifest even more prominently among firms' earnings call discussions. So we find this close alignment here really reassuring, right? It seems that our index contains significant information when it comes to capturing business decision makers' perception or concerns over the tension. Now, moving on to the other set of exercises we do for the same purpose, right? We just want to see if our index makes sense, if it does capture public concerns over US-China tension. So the way we do it here this time is going to be in the context of firms' real decisions. So if we all sit back and reflect for a second on fundamentally why people would worry about US-China tension, right, from an economic perspective, right? What makes US-China tension salient economically? It's really that it raises risk and uncertainty about new bilateral barriers to be put in place that would disrupt the normal course of business transactions, right? Such increases in uncertainty, I mean, when you put it in the context of classical economic theory, the real options theory would then say, with this increase in uncertainty, a wait and see attitude would create strong incentives to delay economic decisions that are really difficult to undo, such as firm investment. So the core idea here is that when firms have these decisions that are very expensive to reverse, that are very difficult to undo, such as large amounts of investment, large amounts of capital expenditures, decision makers are going to be very cautious about undertaking these actions. And they're going to be particularly anxious when uncertainty is high, such as uncertainty surrounding escalated bilateral friction that would disrupt the business dealing and weigh on investment payoffs. Right? So fundamentally, it's really the lack of clarity on what will or will not be forbidden. It's making firms really reluctant to commit to large amounts of investment, right? So As we say, when you are in the dark room, you try not to move much. So to that end, what we would expect is that the heightened UCT, heightened US-China tension, would be associated with a retrenchment in firms' investment decisions. So we look to see if it holds in the data. We basically just estimate the average relationship between our UCT index and US firms' investment. And the way we do it is really straightforward. We just put in lagged UCT into an otherwise standard test of Q theory of investment. So the dependent variable here is investment rate, which is capital expenditure scaled by lagged total assets. The subscript L here, that's the time gap between investment and our UCT. So what we're estimating here is how a change in UCT index today now would impact firm investment in the next quarter up to 4 quarters out in the future. And we have all the standard firm level and macro level controls that are shown to be associated with firm decisions. A negative coefficient beta 1 here would be consistent with the idea that heightened UCT depresses firm investment. And that's what we find. So that you can see that the coefficients are negative. They're statistically significant up to 4 quarters out. There seems to be strong indication that increases in UCT index are associated with protracted declines in firm investment. And in fact, that's persistent up to 4 quarters out, both statistically and economically significant. I will mention that we have the standard firm control variables such as sales growth, cash flows, and Q, which represents firm investment opportunities. And we also carefully control for current and expected macro conditions. And we have firm fixed effects, and the effects I'm showing you here are also robust at both firm and industry levels. Now, so we've shown that on average, there's a negative response in firm investment to UCT index, right? Firms on average tend to contract their investment when UCT index rises. And we want to go deeper. We want to gather more indication on whether our index makes sense. So the next question we ask ourselves is that, do we see such an investment response more pronounced among firms that are vulnerable, relatively more vulnerable to such bilateral tension, right? So the idea here is that we would expect that these firms whose economic decision and performance critically depend on a collaborative bilateral relation, or put differently, more vulnerable to US-China tension, we would expect them to show stronger investment response. And unfortunately, no metrics are available to proxy for such exposure to the bilateral tension, not at the industry level, not at the firm level. So we have to take on the task of constructing such metrics. And the way we go about it is to adopt the efficient market view, right? So the idea is that those firms who are more quote unquote vulnerable to US-China tension, you would expect their stock returns to experience sharper declines when UCT rises, when US-China tension rises. So what we end up doing is to estimate that sensitivity of a firm's stock returns to movements in UCT index. So specifically for every single public listed firm in the US, what we do is to compute the sensitivity of its excess stock returns to the UCT index, to monthly movements in UCT, and controlling for the common factors that are used to explain stock returns. And if you think about these firms with negative UCT beta, what that means is that these firm stock returns tend to fall when UCT rises, right? These are the firms, their stock returns really suffer when US tension rises. So we interpret these firms as being vulnerable to US-China tension. And conversely, for these firms with positive UCT beta, meaning that these firms' stock returns tend to rise when tension rises, when UCT index rises, we interpret these firms as being immune to or even providing a hedge against rises in the tension. Just to have a proof of concept, we look at the industry distributions of the firm UCT beta estimates. If you look at these firms with the most negative UCT beta, right, that means these firms' stock returns really fall a lot, right? They fall most when UCT rises. These firms tend to be concentrated in industries related to electronic and computer equipment and software. And on the other end of the spectrum, if you look at these firms with the most positive, the largest positive UCT beta, these are the firms whose stock returns rise quite a bit. When UCT rises, these firms are concentrated in industries related to utilities, real estate, and insurance. So after seeing these intuitive patterns, recall our overarching goal here is to see if this negative investment response to tension, to UCT, is more concentrated among firms with stronger exposure to US-China tension, more vulnerable to US-China tension. So we're going to incorporate these metrics in our investment regression. Because these metrics, these beta estimates are inevitably rough, so we can create dummy variables to flag those firms that are relatively more vulnerable to a China tension. So here we create dummy variables that indicate firms whose UCT beta falls under the 10s, 20s, up to 50s percentile. You can think about these firms as being having the most negative betas, right? The firms that are most sensitive to US-China tension gauged from their stock return sensitivities. So we include each of them one at a time in our investment regression over here. And we also, you can see that they tend to be capital intensive. And again, the dependent variable has always been investment, right? And we also interact each of them with our UCT index, right? So what our primary interest is, it's really focused on the coefficients of the interaction term, right? So a negative and a statistically significant, a negative coefficient for the interaction term would imply an amplification effect, right? And that's what we find. So across the board, we find that those firms that are relatively more vulnerable to US-China tension, in the sense that their stock returns fall a lot when UCT rises, they also show a stronger investment response, right? You see them having a significantly stronger retrenchment in their firm investment when UCT rises. Now, I understand that our UCT beta is actually constructed using our UCT index itself. So potentially there could be circularity in the reasoning. So we want to have alternative metrics that are independent of our UCT index itself. To the extent that trade linkage is so prominent between the two countries. So we want to look to see if firms that trade intensively with China would show a stronger investment response. So based on the data we gather from the Census Bureau, we create these dummy variables indicating these industries that export most heavily to China, percent of industries that export most to China, and another dummy for the top 10% industries that import most from China. And we incorporate each of them one at a time in our investment regression. Again, we're always curious about what happens to firm investment. That's the main dependent variable here. You see that the exporting firms are capital intensive, and you also see that they're associated with a stronger, statistically significant strong amplification effect, right? These firms that export a lot in industries that export a lot to China, they really contract their investment significantly more during periods of heightened tension. And if you look at the firms that import a lot from China, they are labor intensive to begin with. Again, this is investment on the left-hand side. They're labor intensive to begin with. They don't do much investment to begin with. And the amplification effect is not statistically significant. Now, moving on to the sort of the last exercise we do with the objective of evaluating our index. This is the last metric I'm going to show you, I promise. I know it's been a lot. And so this time, so as I alluded to earlier, right, we have this very strong view that US-China tension really spans over a broad spectrum of issues. And arguably, people have this consensus that the focus of the tension has also been shifting away from trade towards more focused on security and technology. And this holistic view of US-China tension is also reflected in our index and the way we construct it, the way we interpret. It goes beyond trade. So to that end, we want to construct a general measure of firm exposure to the tension, sort of going beyond the realm of trade, right? So the way we do that is to still go back to this efficient market perspective. And the idea is that if you think about these US firms, these American firms whose economic activity and business success would really depend a lot on a collaborative relation. These set of firms would include these US firms with strong ties with China, including those firms who derive a lot of their revenues and sales from their markets in China. So in this case, everything else equal, these firms' business success would then become exposed to the movements in the Chinese economy. Right? So everything else equal, we would expect these firm stock returns to rise and fall with the Chinese stock market index. So with that thought in mind, we went ahead and estimated firms' China beta, right? Their exposure to China, their exposure to the Chinese economy. And the way we do it is to estimate the co-movements of a firm's idiosyncratic stock returns with the Chinese stock market index. And here you can think about a positive beta, a very large beta, as representing these firms who source and sell a lot in China. And we again use indicator variables that flag those firms with extensive exposure to China, as reflected by China beta estimates being above the 50s, 60s, up to 90s percentile of the estimate distribution. And we again incorporate each of them one at a time in our investment regression. And we're primarily interested in the coefficient of the interaction term, right? Again, we want to see if there is any amplification in the negative investment response to UCT among those firms with extensive exposure to China. And we do find indications along those lines, right? So if you see these firms with extensive exposure to China as proxied by having China beta being above 70th percentile, these firms show a significantly stronger investment response to UCT, right? Again, they're cutting back on their investment significantly more aggressively during periods of escalated tension, judged from these estimates. Now, so if you if you think back on the average relationship between investment, firm level investment, and our UCT index, right? You have these, you see this pattern that heightened UCT, increases in UCT, depress firm investment, right? Associated with protracted declines in investment. And you think back on this heterogeneity in the cross-section of firms in that investment response that systematically depends on UCT beta, on trade linkage, on China beta. I would say that the confluence of results here is consistent with the idea that the UCT index is correlated with investment decisions in ways that are consistent with classical economic theory and make intuitive sense, right? And now you take that and you think back on the chart where the UCT index moves in lockstep with the share of US firms' earnings call discussion that's devoted to US-China tension. And so there are, taken together, there are data patterns indicating that our UCT index contains significant information. Now, with the hope, with the optimistic hope that I've made some progress in convincing you that our index is informative in terms of meaningfully capturing the ups and downs in the bilateral tension as perceived by major economic agents. And with this index at hand, right, and frankly, the only quantitative, again, a shout out to Maggie, that very nice preview that this only the first and only index, quantitative index, a holistic measure on the bilateral tension, right? We want to ask, how much does it really matter economically, right? Um, how much this rising tension between the two powers would matter. And the way we do that is to estimate the monthly VARs following the standard macroeconomic literature. So I'm showing the snapshot of our results here. So what you see is that in response to a 1 standard deviation shock to UCT, there is protracted declines in US aggregate output, and there is persistent decline in the bilateral trade. You also see unemployment rise in the medium term. Here we have the effective tariff rate as measured by the import duty scaled by the total import custom values. And you also see a persistent increase. It seems that there is persistent, long-lasting friction in the bilateral trade. And I'll bring your attention to the last chart here. And there's also a hike in US firms' credit costs as measured by excess bond premium, a widely used metric that's computed from corporate bond spread. Right? So it seems like US firms in the medium term would also suffer from an increase in their borrowing costs. And the main results here, the contraction in the aggregate output, the increase in unemployment, the trade effect, and the credit cost spike, they are robust to different ordering assumptions in the VAR, and they're also robust to including a bunch more other factors that are used to account for aggregate dynamics. Now, this is the last chart I will show you. So here we're bringing in Chinese aggregate data to paint a more complete picture of the economic effects of rising tension between the two countries. So you see that we have aggregate output industrial production from both countries, US and China, and we have price levels. We have both components of trade. I don't know if you will see the little hand that I'm playing around with here. And we have the effective tariff rate. We also have, for monetary policy, we have treasury bill rate and Chinese M2, and we also incorporate the nominal exchange rate here. So again, in response to a 1 standard deviation shock, positive shock to UCT, a rise in the tension, aggregate output contract in both countries. About 8-9 months after the shock, effectively the trough, the US aggregate output shrinks by 0.15%. And the Chinese industrial production shrinks by 0.1%. So it seems the negative effect on aggregate output is milder and less persistent in China. And both components of trade contract sizably. So the Chinese export to US would decline by 0.35%, and Chinese imports from US would decline more by about 0.75%. And again, you see the long-lasting friction in the bilateral trade in terms of persistent increase in the effective tariff rate. Also, the dollar appreciates against the yuan, which is consistent with the conventional safe haven role of the dollar in times of global strife. So now I just want to take a minute to conclude. What do we know prior? What do we know prior to this study? What we know is that US-China tension runs deep. And we'll also know that that tension could span over a growing set of consequential issues, ranging from, say, information security, currency practices, technological innovation, environmental policy, and military buildup, geopolitical conflicts involving the two countries and beyond. What we do not know is how much it matters, right? What are the quantitative economic effects from fluctuations in such tension, from particularly a rise in the tension? And that's precisely what we do in this project, right? We construct the reason that we do not know the magnitude of the quantitative economic effects is that we do not have a quantitative indicator on such bilateral tension, and that's where our analysis comes in, right? We do precisely that. We construct a metric that would proxy for the fluctuations in the bilateral tension, and we show evidence that this index we construct contains significant information information content. And with this metric in hand, frankly, I think would be a metric that would enable all of us to do important analyses that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So with this index, we have carefully vetted, we find data patterns indicating that rises in tension could propagate through the real economy by delaying firm investment, by really depressing firm investment activities. And from our VER analysis, we see that following rises in the tension, the aggregate output in both countries contract, and there is persistent decline in the bilateral trade. Unemployment also rises in both countries. So data suggests that both countries lose from escalated tension. It's something we've known for decades from textbooks on blackboards, but not in empirical measurables. And we want to put a magnitude on it. And I'll leave you with this. So what's the punchline here? US-China tension does loom large. And these harmful economic effects, they are not just temporary, but rather on a sustained basis. So with that, I will stop. I'm really keen to gauge Mary's thoughts and learn from her expertise. And I'll stop sharing the slides.
Great, thanks, Bo. Thanks for the very interesting presentation. Now let me turn the mic to Mary, who will share her remarks about the research.
Yeah, thank you, Maggie. Thank you, Bo. That was such a clear presentation. I think we all really, understood more deeply what you're doing in this paper. It's really quite impressive. It's a detailed and innovative method. I think it's illustrative of a growing literature that uses machine learning methods to enable analysis of text-based information. It's really allowing researchers to, chart new paths. Let me just give you one example of another way in which this type of analysis is being used. You mentioned, of course, the work that's been done on in the US with newspaper reports in the aggregate economy. It's also being used to do things like look at text-based industrial policies of different countries, things that, before we were maybe limited to using a dummy variable, yes, no, and now we're able to look at what types of industries and what types of instruments can be used or are being used by different countries. So I think it's a very exciting growing area of research, and you really, kind of did like a little textbook on how especially if you read the paper, on how this can be done and how these types of methods, which to a lot of people will seem very black box, we don't know what's in the machine learning algorithms, et cetera, but you really go that extra mile to validate what you've done. So I think that's really interesting and really helpful for researchers who want to get into this area of research. I think you're working on a very important topic. I really probably don't have to make that case, but US-China tensions just, suffuse everything that's happening. It's really hard to get through a conversation on anything in Washington without talking about US-China tensions. It clearly is, driving part of the US-EU relationship. It certainly looms large in the Indo-Pacific strategic framework. These are two, of course, US-centric views, but clearly it's extremely important in Asia to Asian countries. So Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Malaysia, ASEAN itself, they'll all be talking about what is happening with these two gigantic economies and whether there will be collateral damage or impact for them. And I'll come back to that a little later when I think about and try to sort of suggest some ideas for where you might go next with this research. It's very interesting when we think about how these tensions will move forward and whether they will usher in a new era of deglobalization. Some of you may have seen Paul Krugman's column this morning. It was about a new era of deglobalization. And thinking back to the teaching that I've done for 30 years on different waves of globalization, and in my career, of course, the biggest story has been China's emergence in the global economy. And to think that I might still be active and on this earth while we see this next wave of deglobalization was sort of took me by surprise and think, wow, are we really on the cusp of this? And so I think you're really tapping into a very important force. We know that deglobalization will be spurred in large part by governmental decisions. We have seen, for example, dramatically over the last month about the decision by Russia to invade Ukraine and what effect that has already had on investments, financial flows, companies pulling out of Russia, changing their supply chain. So we know that globalization will happen by the force of millions of public and private decisions. And how do we capture that? How do we think about what will drive those decisions? And I think one of the things that you're trying to highlight is that there is risk and uncertainty that is engendered, not just for the firms directly involved, but for all firms. And we want to explore how they respond. And some of those firms will be negatively impacted. Some might be positively impacted, just as we saw with the US-China trade war itself. Some firms were hurt because they were importing material from China and had to pay tariffs, but some firms gained because now they became the substitute suppliers, not just in the US, but in other countries as well. So with this, deglobalization is going to happen by these myriad of responses, and we need to think about how we can capture that. So what you do is you say, how can we quantify these public concerns over tensions? And you turn to these newspaper articles. And then you want to ask, do these tensions really matter for economic outcomes? We think they do, but we have a lot to learn about how they do. So I think you convincingly demonstrate proof of concept. The method here results in what looks to be very reliable measurement. The spikes agree with major newsworthy events. One would expect that, right? Since they're from newspaper accounts, if they don't, agree with the major events of the day, it's like, well, what are you capturing? So that was indeed, as you said, reassuring. You say that the newspapers, are an important vehicle for the spread and coordination of beliefs. And I think that's very interesting. But I might just ask, whose beliefs do they represent? And I guess urge you to think about maybe even expanding beyond the current sample of newspapers that you have. Now, that may seem to be too much work, and I understand that. This is an incredibly labor-intensive activity that you're engaged in. But we know that the papers that you mentioned are basically read by the elites, and they're driven by the elites and the elites' view. You said you yourself said that these are the papers that business leaders follow. Being in contact with these reporters and these newspapers all the time, I would say that that is true. It is what the elites are talking about. It's a little bit of an ecosphere. It might be nice to broaden that out to other forms of media or even regional newspapers to see what, how is say a Caterpillar or a Deere company responding to the same things. Perhaps they are. So let's just step back for a minute and ask, what do we want to know about the effects of US-China tensions, and which questions would most appropriately be addressed using the methods that you have? So I want to say first that not all questions are best addressed by these methods. For example, a very important question that has been asked by a variety of teams is, what is the effect of the US-China tariffs on US import quantity, Chinese import quantity, on prices, producer prices, consumer prices. And I think that the methods that are used there were appropriate and did not require the types of the inputs that you use. Another question, how do firms respond to the tariff? That's a very important question. And I think that if we look at what is the direct effect of tariffs, the answer also is no, this is not the right method. We are able to appropriately capture, using the tariff change, we're able to capture the stimulus that's being applied to the firm just with traditional methods. Where I think your method comes in is that we know that there is just a lot of let me just put it this way. It's in the air. It's in a sense, it's not quite Keynes' animal spirits, but we know that these tensions lead companies to change their forecasts of future policies and future constraints and barriers. That is very hard for us. There's no delta T for us to capture. And I think there that you're offering an exciting option for people to think about in looking at how these uncertainties translate to firms that are not directly affected. And of course, oftentimes that part of the economy is much bigger than the directly affected economy. And so these economic impacts can be quite large. But as of yet, we have been sort of unable to capture it. In fact, if we think about it, we know that the existing literature on the effect of uncertainty, which is, of course, dominated by the work done by Schott and Pierce and Kyle Hanley and Nunu Lamau and others, showed that there was a very robust response to the change and uncertainty about the granting of permanent normal trade relations to China. And it affected not only exports, imports, but I think most importantly, firm investment. Now, we can't put everything we know, that's one event. And we want to know, does this uncertainty effect, is it important more generally? And I think that's another way in which you come in, you're offering, you're not using this PNTR gap measure that everybody else uses. And you're saying, look, this uncertainty affects businesses of all types. So let's look at what you do with your index now that I've expressed my enthusiasm for the index. I think some of the things you do are not surprising, and you call them validation exercises. And I suppose that means you think the only surprising thing here would be if the correlations didn't show up, right? And the most important one there, I think, is the correlations with earning calls and what people talk about on earning calls. And having been in conversations now with lots of corporations, I can tell you, yeah, what's in the news is what they want to know. So if this test didn't work, we wouldn't have any faith. So, you pass that test with 3-star, good, very good. Okay, but you also go on to do a whole series of things on investment and label that validation. I think that's really underselling what you're doing here. To me, this is the most interesting part of the paper and by far the most solid part of the paper. What you are showing is that firm investment is sensitive to these tensions. And I'd really like to see you develop that part of the paper further. I think that is absolutely fascinating. Some of the things you do, I think you could go much further. You look at a variety of ways to do it. First, just showing that it seems to be that higher tensions lead to lower firm investment. You're not happy with that. You say that can't be, this average effect can't be true of all firms. So let's try to tease out which firms are most connected to China. I think you rightly criticize your own work with the beta that you create, and then go on to look at those that have trade linkages. The trade linkages results are a little disappointing from my point of view. Exports seem to show, imports don't. That's very odd, since firms that imported were the most affected by the US-China trade war. Again, just one example, but I would urge you to really dig more deeply into those. You keep talking about firms that have earn a large share of their revenue in China. It seems to me you may have more information on these firms that you can use. But to me, that is extremely interesting. And it must be, if we think there must be both losers and winners. There have to be firms that gain when those that are tightly wound to China lose. They may be firms, we know that firms vary a lot in how globally engaged they are. And this could be one measure that you might think about. So I would urge you very much to put into that a little less on the method. It's great. You've shown that you've just done a terrific job. What does it tell us? And this idea about firm investment and in uncertainty is really vitally important, especially as we're looking ahead and thinking these tensions don't look like they're going to be declining anytime soon. So I found that extremely important. The second message I want to get across is that I would really like to know if you can disaggregate the tensions further. So do we really expect, say, tariff retaliation from China to have the same effect on firm investment as technology conflict, or as China building on islands in the South China Sea? So I think that you list 3 topics. I think it's economy, security, and one more. Was it human rights? Bo can tell me. There's one other thing I haven't listed here. Ideology, which, yeah. And I think these are very different sources of tension. Now, why is it important to disaggregate further? We want to know or predict what's going to happen if the US government or the Chinese government does X versus Y. With your tension, I don't think we can. We can after the fact go back and say, oh yeah, that affected investment. But at this point in our history, I think we need to be warning about the costs of disengagement. And there, I think knowing what types of tension, what are the impulses here, is vitally important. Lastly, I would say that your work on the aggregate effects, I found least convincing. Yeah, okay, you found these impulses, but it just looked like a grab bag of outcomes. I mean, tariffs, I don't know what here's some more structural kind of thinking I think would really be useful. I don't think that they're particularly convincing. I would like to see either more focus on the investment, less on this, or a little bit more. Why do you think these variables would be affected and why would it last? That part to me just wasn't as convincing. And I think that the other parts are so rich that it points in a particular direction. Okay, so let me wrap up. I just urge the authors to consider how these tensions affect investment. I would also urge them to look at how it affects investment by our trading partners. This is vitally important. You know, the US has so far basically, in my view, ignored what is now coming to be called collateral damage. Very little thought was put into what the effect of the US tariffs were on our Asian partners other than China. And I think you could look at that with your data. That would be really exciting and useful. So let me say thank you both for this innovative work. I know this represents hours of effort. I think that it's a very rich and exciting vein of research. And I urge you to really look at how your work can inform the challenges that we face today at such a critical point for US-China relations. Thank you. Thanks, Maggie.
Thanks, Mary, for the very rich discussions. In fact, I see Mary's comments, some of the comments really greatly overlap with my own and some of the comments that have already appeared in the Q&A box, including, for example, the sample of the newspapers included in the construction of the index. Why not include, you know, regional papers and also papers at the other side end of the political spectrum? And also the question about third country effects, you know, other countries. So these questions have also shown up from our audience. So I will give for a few minutes to first respond to Mary's comments before we get to the Q&A questions, okay? And in the meantime, please feel free to put in more comments and questions in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Mary and Maggie. I mean, I am just wowed by how helpful these comments are, Mary. I'm taking a whole page of notes, and it's great. I mean, so let me first say that I agree. I completely agree with what you've shared, and I really appreciate your capacity to just elevate what we do onto a broader level that could allow our work to speak to a broader audience. And that definitely, the comments you provided and the suggestions would really help us reach a broader audience and have a bigger picture contribution. So I'm really thankful for that. So I also want to respond to everything, but let me just single out a few that I think are um, that I have something tangible to say rather than thank you so much, we'll do that, right? And then, so one thing is that you mentioned this uncertainty effect, right? And that this is in the context of your comment on what questions might or might not benefit from such a holistic metric, so to speak. And I really agree that's one area where this more comprehensive metric could play a role, right? Because if you look at these excess bond premium, this firm credit cost response, I think there are some limited indication. We should definitely dig deeper, but there seems to be some indication that there might be some risk on, risk off effects going on, and that might be related to the general uncertainty effects that you have in mind. And then I will also say that it's also we're thinking that if you look at sort of the actual tariff changes, where you think about the realization of new barriers being put in place, there's only so few of that over the sample we study. Despite, sorry, I need to have the 1 second, the running out of battery. There's only so few of that during the sample we study. So in terms of what's really driving what we find in terms of significant economic effects, it's really coming down to fear of such escalation in bilateral tension, that in bilateral barriers or frictions that might or might not have realized, right? So that's one thing I want to agree with you that I think that's really in terms of transmission channels, I think the fear of newly added bilateral friction is driving a lot of the economic decisions, at least gauged from our analysis. So related to transmission, right? You talk about a couple of things. I want to have a quick response. One is that the investment effects, and you are so generous. You say that we're underselling that part of the analysis, and I agree. I think that related to sort of propagation mechanisms, how does this rise in tension, what looks like just the two countries bashing on each other, right, in the media or in G7, but then how does that translate into actual economic activity changes? I do think that what we did in the firm level analysis, how investment moves on average, and not just on average, but also in that heterogeneity in the cross section that systematically depend on firm exposure, that could really inform us about the transmission channels. So we'll definitely take it further, and we'll also work on what you and Maggie both mentioned in terms of the collateral damage. What about U.S. trading partners? What happens there in terms of their investment decisions when the tension fluctuates? So I really appreciate that set of comments. And then back to the index itself, right? And then two things I want to just highlight that you mentioned, you and Maggie both mentioned that are really helpful. One is what about regional newspapers, right? It's true that we're looking at a sort of quote unquote elite set of newspapers. And that's in line with our thoughts that let's look at these major business decision makers, right? Let's look at these public listed companies that we have data access to from CompuStat. But it's definitely true that in terms of the winner loser dynamics that you mentioned, and there is indeed large cross-section differences geographically as well. So we definitely are putting this on our to-do list to look at regional newspapers, right? As you mentioned, Mary, it's labor intensive. We gonna prioritize, but hopefully in the future, I think we can utilize regional newspaper coverage and get to that geographic heterogeneity that we haven't been able to touch on. Now, also on the index, you mentioned disaggregation. So we did exert quite a bit of effort on trying to separate out newspaper articles that discuss economic issues versus security-related issues versus ideology. What turns out to be the case is that these three sub-indices move very closely with each other, and then we also find that in terms of the effects, you are not so much convinced by VR. And I side with you, but and also putting them in VR, you get very similar responses. So right now we're putting in the appendix, but I think that we could do more. We could do more to have a clear distinction, with this caveat that we economists tend to think everything boils down to economics. So that might be something that's being playing out in the newspaper as well. And also we would really drill down to the VR. I agree. We can do more. We're equipped to do more. We can do historical decomposition. We can do something structural. And let me just end by commenting on this winner and loser dynamics. So it's true that, if you think about our UCT beta, China beta, trade linkage. So what we have in mind is that we are curious about these firms who sell and source a lot in China, right? So you can think about, if you think about the types of firms who are particularly quote unquote sensitive to the bilateral tension, this would include firms that trade a lot with China, that have supply chain reliance on China, that are in security sensitive industries that are easy targets for sanctions from each other's administration. And this would also include firms with a lot of physical and financial investments in each other's markets, particularly this way, right? US firms with a lot of physical and thinking about all the automobile industries, Tesla having gigantic factories in China. And so, but you're absolutely right? So in our literature, in our economics literature, I think recently people have, there is work that has drawn a lot of attention on these redistributional, adverse distributional consequences from the China trade shock, and manufacturing job losses are deep and persistent, a lot deeper, a lot more persistent than economists as a community we used to think about. And so I guess that the way in my mind, the way I think about our work is that there is the rising tide does not lift all boats. So there is work that focus on the boats that get flipped over in the water, and then we are looking at the rising tide that lifts most boats. And I guess there is the idea that the globalization, the integration of trading partners, especially something as powerful as US and China, it really increases GDP, it really increases aggregate welfare, something that we as a profession have known since 1950s. And I guess that there is growing voice over the years related to the political rhetoric that's inflamed, is that there are slices of the pie that shrink sufficiently that on that they contract in both labor market and product market. But I guess what we're trying to push on is that at the end of the day, it does increase the size of the pie in the aggregate. But with that, I will stop, and I will just reiterate how thankful I am for the fantastic comments. And with these comments, I'm confident that we can bring this up a notch level up. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Board. Thanks, Mary. So we have had a line of comments and questions coming in the Q&A box. These are really excellent questions, if I may say. So I'm just going to go through them, maybe in sort of try to group them a little bit. So Jeffrey, one of our PhD students, has been asking quite a few questions, some already addressed by Mary and Board. But one question for in particular, tension is reciprocal, right? So you have been focusing on the US media and use that as your basis of constructing the tension index. But how about Chinese media? Have you thought about looking at a set of papers in China, including the Xinhua News Agency or Weibo, right? The sort of the Twitter version in China. Have you considered doing that to measure the Chinese perspective on U.S.-China tensions? Because when business executives think about investing in China, they are concerned not just about the U.S. view but also the Chinese view. I know this is going to be extremely challenging, right? Redoing the algorithms and machine learning based on the Chinese text, but just wondering whether you guys have thought about that.
It's currently underway. And I would say John's move to Fudan University also has facilitated this part of the progress. Yes, so we're working on that as well.
Okay.
Can't wait to show you guys when we get something solid there. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so the next question comes from my colleague Susan Arison, and I guess it's also sort of related to one other comment from Marcos. So I mean, these are more, I guess not directly related to the project itself. These are questions that many of us are wondering. So right now with all the tensions, right, we're sort of dividing the sphere, right, into two camps, right, including in the technology area. So both questions sort of ask if you have anything to say about the opposite of tension, potential cooperation, rather than using these, tariffs and quotas and sanctions. Do you see any hope of the other side of the relationship? To put it more tangible, I know because this is a overarching question, to put it in more tangible terms, have you thought about looking at searching keywords related to cooperation? Any signals of cooperation? Do we see the symmetric effects on investments? And that might give us some hope, right? Because I believe in the timeline you looked at, there must be some discussions of cooperation, either on climate change or healthcare or other technology areas. So have you thought about doing that? Anything we can expect out of the cooperative end?
So I'll say two things, Maggie, and I really appreciate this comment too. And we've all spending some thoughts on this bifurcation in technological innovation and the impact on economic decisions, right? For example, in my mind, with this bifurcation underway, when you are losing partnership and you're losing access to a significant market in the other country, and everything else equal, right? That would reduce incentives to innovate just because of the expected reduction in sales. And so bifurcation is definitely very concerning. And we would again, we would try to think of ways to provide more insights into that with the index we have. Currently, we haven't done much work. And now I do want to say the symmetric effect, to the extent that if you think about this panel regressions, to the extent that you would think that a decrease in UCT would imply a more amicable relation forming, would be a move towards the collaborative tone between the two countries. So I guess that you would say the other way of interpreting these coefficients would be that improvement in the bilateral collaboration would tend to increase firm investment. So there's nothing there in our analysis that would be specifically restricted to escalation in the tension. I think that could be applied on the other direction of changes as well. But we will look deeper, and it's interesting to think that potentially, with this machinery set up already, we could also do let's look at these cooperative words and what do we get there. That could be another one of the gazillions validation exercise we do, right? And yeah, I appreciate that comment.
Excellent. So there's another very good comment here. And the question, it comes from Eric Clifton, who asked, the UCT index seems to fit the past well, but can we use the UCT to do any forecasting about the future? And I think this is, what we usually hope to do with indexes, right? When we have an index, we hope to tell us not just something about the past, but what we can anticipate about the future. And then Eric also has another question with the rise of social media, which I think is a great question. Will newspaper-based measures continue to be useful? Should we look at tweets, for example, to get more, micro, sense of sentiments, right, on this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And this growing literature is indeed venturing into Twitter space. So I think that's something we could be doing as well. Now, in terms of forecasting power, so I guess my personal interpretation was the caveat that Mary raised in terms of how much statistical power one would take from the VAR analysis. I would think that the VAR analysis gives us a sense of what's coming up, right? It's if you see a rise in the share of newspapers discussing rising tension this month, 9 months into the future, it's expected to see some declines in real economic activities. And then you think about the firm investment regressions, you will say that over the next a few quarters up to a year, there's been decline. So in that sense, there is the predictive power, the forecasting aspect to it. But other than that, I guess that we're not making political statements about what's gonna come up. I mean, that's something outside the scope of the machinery here. But that does get me thinking in terms of what our index can do in terms of the forecasting realm of things. Hopefully next time we talk, we'll have more tangible to say on that front. And thank you, Eric, for the question. Yep.
Great. And Jeffrey, our Peterson, has another excellent question. And I think this is a question that we always push our students to think deep about, and that is causality. So you are showing the relationship between the index, the US-China tension index on the one hand, and investment, trade, and output on the other hand. But is it really tension causing a decline in investment? Or perhaps the tariffs and deteriorating trade investment relationship causing more mentioning of US-China tensions in the newspaper? How should we think about the direction of causality, right? And I think this is, you use lag in your regression, right? You're looking at the lag effects of the tension or word mention of tension on the investment. But, could we interpret the result as reverse causality or some other factors like, just tariffs and, other things causing both to move in together? So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I appreciate this. I wrestled with it myself for the longest time, and I will with the caveat that we're never gonna. I mean, not never. It's a inherently difficult challenge to completely tease out causality, beyond causation. I will say two things. One is that to the extent that in the VER analysis, we're really looking at shocks to UCT in the sense that these are movements in the UCT index that are orthogonal to or contemporaneously unrelated to the slower moving macro variables such as IPE and employment and price levels. There is some effort that we've done there in addressing the endogeneity concerns. And now going back to the part of the work that Mary likes most, which is also my personal favorite too, on the firm level investment, right? To the extent that you would worry less that individual firms' decision triggering news media coverage or triggering movements in the tension between these two existing incumbent and emerging superpowers. I guess the endogeneity there is also somewhat addressed, but still, I fully acknowledge that our paper, as any other papers in the macro realm of things has a long way to go in really hammering down the causality with everything correlated with everything else. Yep, I appreciate the careful thought.
Maggie, can I just hop in on this one?
Yeah, sure.
So I think, Bo's obviously right. This is just a very difficult question. But if we think about taking this to firm decisions where the firms are located outside the US, I think that goes part of the way to solving the problem. Also, kind of separating the uncertainty part, I asked for more clarity on what she was measuring from the tariff. So one of the examples you gave is, do we know if it's the tariff or uncertainty about the tariffs? Well, not all firms were subject to the tariff, and foreign firms might be subject to the tariff if they have investments in the US, but basically not. So there are certain types of trade that would not be affected by the tariffs. And if you can find, Bo, any leverage on those types of things, I would say that would be very convincing evidence of this investment channel. And I think quite informative more generally for our understanding of how uncertainty affects firm behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. Somehow,
yeah.
Sorry, Meg, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to mention that on a very related topic, actually. So this is Mary's comment about looking at the effects on, I guess, third country firms or third market decisions is actually also the question we have just received from from Frank Wang, the co-chair of our IIEP executive circle. And this is a great question because previously we talked about collateral damage, right? How this tension may affect third countries that are also involved, integrated into this relationship. But there's another dimension of third country effects, and that it might not be collateral damage, but rather sort of a spillover, even positive effects on them. Like for example, Frank mentioned, when you have a higher UCT index, right, will we see an increase in China-Europe trade investment as China perhaps reorients its trade and investment with third countries and regions? And similarly, what about US-Vietnam, US other Asian country relationship, right? As US it seeks to reorient its investment and trade. So can we do something in those directions?
Let me piggyback on that, on Frank's question / comment, and say that I would put it in this category that Mary brought up earlier, the set of questions that our youth index can shed light on, can be used to inform us about. And so I find this discussion absolutely fascinating. I would admit that there's been a kind of a blind spot in our thinking, doing this analysis in terms of thinking carefully about the third party countries, what are they doing. And I do see tremendous benefits in bringing them into the picture in terms of addressing endogeneity, in terms of analyzing collateral damage or positive spillover effects. So I'm really grateful for the comments. We'll definitely do that. That would help address a lot of issues and make the analysis much more solid.
Excellent. Thank you so much, both for the responses, and for Mary for all the questions and the comments, and to our audience who have just asked really fantastic questions. And that brings us to the end of our session today. I want to thank everyone for coming and for staying and asking really insightful questions. And I hope you will continue to engage with us and be on the lookout for our future events. Thanks, everyone.